Today we're talking to Vince Warnock about podcasting and the work that goes into preparing for an interview. Vince is an author, marketing strategist, and host of Chasing the Insights. He's been presented with numerous awards and is part of the Fearless 50, a program designed by Adobe to recognize the top 50 marketers in the world who drive bold, fearless marketing and digital transformation. On his podcast, he talks to the biggest and brightest minds in marketing, sales, and entrepreneurship. So Vince, I want to welcome you to the podcast. Thank you very much for being here.
Oh my goodness, Lyndon. Thank you so much for having me. Honestly, it's such an honor being on your show, man.
Before we dive into the good stuff with podcasting and whatever, have you ever visited the Caribbean?
I have not, but I have very big plans to visit the Caribbean because when one of our projects is finished, I'm taking my entire team. We're heading down to Florida. We're going to jump on a cruise ship and we're heading out through the Caribbean. And the goal is to find somewhere beautiful there and probably stay there for another week and then head back. So a way of celebrating all the hard work that everyone's done.
Well, if you make it to Trinidad, please be in touch with me. I would love to host you.
I will definitely. You better get that spare room ready.
I have it already. So listen, this is a special episode for me because I listen to your show. I appreciate your podcast. I've learned a lot from you and your guests, from marketing to podcasting to wearing pants for virtual interviews. You know, when I reached out to you on Instagram, you shared a tool with me called Calendly, which has kind of, open new doors for me. So I appreciate your generosity through your podcasting, and I'm excited to talk to you about your book as well, that you have ChatGPT for marketers. You mentioned that you have another one launched for female entrepreneurs.
Yes. Brand new book called ChatGPT for female entrepreneurs. So it's designed to help as many women as possible. It's designed for two purposes, actually, to help as many female entrepreneurs to accelerate their business. And there's so much in there that'll help them to basically 10x their productivity and to understand how to use these tools for every aspect of their business. But the other reason that we've done it is I'm very aware of the male bias in AI tools. In fact, we've just done some case studies on it and shown definitively that there's a male bias in there. And one of the ways you get rid of bias and things like this is to train as many people, or particularly women or underrepresented people, to use these tools, because the more they use it, the more it trains out the bias. So we're on a bit of a mission there, Lyndon. It's going to be a lot of fun. But yeah, definitely. I'm happy to talk anything with you. Star Wars, podcasting, Caribbean.
Yeah. I am closely following your journey to being a rock star Jedi. I'm heavily invested in it. Recently, I was invited to a podcast, and when the host asked me to introduce myself, I immediately froze. When you're going on as a podcast guest, what are some of the things you consider in crafting a suitable introduction? Are there certain elements that play in an introduction?
Yeah, definitely. The key thing for me is I'm from New Zealand, for those who don't know, and we have a bit of a challenge over here in New Zealand. We have this concept called tall poppy syndrome, which is in most countries, but we tend to have it a lot more over here. And basically what it is we love an underdog. We love it when someone is, doing really, really well, that, comes from nowhere. But the moment someone actually achieves success, we want to tear them down. And it's built into the culture here in New Zealand, where anyone who sticks their head above others gets that head chopped off, essentially. So the problem with that is it also relates to ourselves. So in other words, when I'm telling you, hey, I'm one of the top 50 marketers in the world, on the inside, I tense up, and I don't want to say that because it feels like I'm bragging, and it feels like people are going to think I'm a jerk and going to think I'm arrogant and all this, because that's the culture we grew up in. So it's always been a challenge to me to talk about my backstory and talk about my bio and all this kind of stuff. So what I learned to do, Lyndon, is I learned a couple of things. First of all, I list out my relevant accomplishments. And I don't mean like, I got the Scouts badge for, not tying, or the Scouts badge for I mean, things that are relevant for whatever episode I'm going to be on, or whatever show I'm going to be on. So if I'm going to be talking on a show about podcasting, what I have that I'm, the host of the Chasing the Insights podcast, but I also have some follow-up information on there. For example, the fact that it's one of the top 2% podcasts in the world. Or if I'm, talking about publishing, then I'll mention that I've got a publishing company, but I'll also mention that, I've got a 100% track record on bestsellers. I've got 5 best-selling books out there, those kind of things. So each of these, you have your key kind of takeaway. You'll have something that supports it there. But more importantly, to wrap it all up, you have a little bit of a story there. And that's when people ask me, hey, Vince, where did you come from? How did you start your business? Or, what do you do for people? I basically say, look, I've spent most of my career kind of trying to get noticed, from a child that used to hide away because we grew up in an abusive family. I used to hide away from the world. And then I realized that actually all of us deserve to be seen, and all of us deserve a voice. So I'm on a mission to help other entrepreneurs do that. And I do that through X, Y, Z. So I bring these points to life. So for me, crafting it is really important. So crafting it so that it's agile, so that you can actually change it and shift it up depending on the show you're going to be on and the topic you're going to talk about, but also crafting it in a way that has a story behind it. So that way, for example, when I'm talking about the Adobe Award and getting recognized as one of the top 50 marketers, I don't just blurt it out and say, well, I'm a top 50 marketer. What I say to people is, actually, I used to have the dream job. And, when I was at Cigna, I was the chief marketing officer there. Everything there was on paper, the perfect job. The pay was ludicrous. The bonuses were insane. Like, honestly, we got to work on some crazy stuff. I got the recognition. I got the results when I'm there. Got a slew of awards, including being recognized by Adobe as one of the top 50 marketers in the world. Published my first book when I'm there. And I'm listing out all these credentials, but then I turn it around and say, and none of that mattered because I was miserable. So I'm not doing it as a brag. I'm doing it to showcase to people, actually, despite all of those accomplishments, I was unhappy and I was unfulfilled and therefore needed to step into what I'm doing now, which is incredibly fulfilling. So that's how to get over the shyness of being able to brag about yourself. Or the other thing, I actually have some people who, teach a lot of people to do this. They'll get up there on a podcast and they say, well, all right, if you must twist my arm and make me talk about myself, I'll give you my humble brag. And then they'll tell you about one of their major accomplishments. So it gives them credibility. So it's just kind of lightening it up a little bit and enjoying the process.
As a podcast guest and as content creators, should we get tired of telling our own story? Because I'm thinking about the opposition where you... I'm thinking about the new way... Yes.
Yeah, it's not just tired of telling your stories. It's the fact that, because I had this, I have to tell you this, Lyndon, honestly. So not only do I do a daily podcast, I'm also on many other people's podcasts as well. But I had 2 virtual summits and 4 podcast recordings for other people's shows over 2 days. And I was being interviewed by one of the podcasters and he asked me to tell him a story about something. And I kind of almost froze myself because I'm like, wait, didn't I just tell him this? And I'm like, oh no, that might have been the guy yesterday. Or was that the one earlier today? Oh no, I can't remember who I've told him. So you get in your own head after a little while and you do get sick of your own stories, but you've got to remember that other people, they've never heard it before. Or even if they have, half the time they're not paying attention to you. So if you repeat your story more than once, often the second or third time they might actually pay attention to it and it might drive it home.
And are you a one-man show in terms of like producing your show? Your interview questions?
Kind of. Podcasting for me is a passion. It's something that I really, really enjoy. So for me on my show, I deliberately do not monetize my show, which by the way grieves most other podcasters when they hear that. I have no advertising, no sponsorship, no affiliate links from any of my guests. And they're like, but your numbers. And I went, yep, I know. But I also make sure that there's elements of the show that I do myself. So I have a team that work with me on different stuff. So I have a team that does the graphics for me. I have a team that sends out the emails to the guests and things to make sure that they know all the links and they have all the information that they require to share it in their audience. But the editing of the show, I do myself. And I don't do that because, I can't be bothered outsourcing it, or I don't do that because I can do it better than anyone else. Far from it. I know other people will do a way better job than me. The reason I do the editing is because for me, every guest I have on my show is really important to me because I vet them very strongly. I make sure that anyone on my show is somebody who I know is going to add value to my audience and somebody who genuinely cares. So for me, I'm not just having a guest on my show. I'm building a relationship with these people. So when I go back and edit that episode, it means it's not just a one and done. I haven't just interviewed them, then they're gone away and I forget about them. I'm actually re-listening to the episode myself, reminding myself why this person was so special and going, oh my goodness, I forgot we talked about that. That's really powerful. And then I always use that as an opportunity to then follow up with them and go, hey, I was just editing your show. Oh my goodness, I can't believe we talked about this and this. Look, let's jump on a call. I want to talk to you about maybe a collaboration, or is there any way I can help you with this? So it's just an opportunity for me to reconnect with all these incredible guests. And I've had over 500 guests recorded. So we've got about 460 that are live at the moment, 500 different people from around the world. And I can honestly say, Lyndon, some of those have gone on to become some of my best friends. It's just insane.
Definitely. And listen, I am a big fan of Chasing the Insights. I am a couple episodes behind right now. And for the listener, what I will do is I will put the links to Vince's show and books in the show notes so you can check it out. One of the things I'm really struggling with as a one-man show is that I have a guest. I spend days researching them, and I love the research process. But it's taking me like about sometimes 16 to 24 hours to get into the guest, the work that they've done, and that process takes me so long. So once you've confirmed that guest, what does your planning look like in terms of getting the most out of your time and then having a quality conversation with them?
Well, I tell you what. So here's my process. I always do a pre-call with everybody. So in other words, I get them on a pre-call and I chat a little bit about them and a little bit about the show so they know what to expect. And I'm doing that for three reasons. One, because I want to set the expectation with them so they're not sitting there when I'm interviewing them going, where's he going with this? What? And then I say, give me 3 practical tips. They're like, and they're panicking because they haven't had time to prepare it. So I want them to be aware of that. The second reason is so that I can find out a little bit about them. And I only say a little bit specifically. I'll tell you why soon. And then the third reason is because I'm building a rapport with them, but I'm also checking to make sure that they are actually suitable for the show. There have been people I have turned down. In fact, I've turned down some very big name podcasters entrepreneurs before because they just didn't fit my audience, which turns out their ego wasn't too happy with, but they'll get over it, I'm pretty sure. But the reason I said only small amount of backstory from them or finding out a little bit about them is because I actually don't do research on my guests on purpose. Because one of the things I discovered, Lyndon, is it's very easy to kind of if you've done a whole pile of research on a guest, for example, you know all the things, so you kind of know where the show's going. When you don't, you are now in the mind of the audience. You're hearing things the same time the audience is hearing this. And that can produce some really amazing serendipitous results. And I'll give you a good example of this. I had a guest on my show, absolutely wonderful, wonderful woman named Shimrit. And she was explaining about this concept of nonverbal communication. And she said, look, Vince, most people don't know this, but I had, when I was younger, I had a brother who was born with cerebral palsy and water on the brain. And I'm sitting there going, what? And she goes, and he couldn't communicate, but whenever him and I were around, we had this weird, almost telepathic connection with each other. I almost knew what he was thinking. He knew what I was thinking. And he passed away when he was quite young. And the reason that made me kind of take a step back is that exact thing happened to me. My brother passed away when he was 3.5. He was born with water on the brain, cerebral palsy. We actually adopted him into my family. And him and I did have that kind of telepathic bond. So the fact that I heard that for the first time on the show meant immediately I was reacting like maybe the audience would, where they're like, whoa, I didn't know this. And it put me in the audience shoes, but it put me in it created this incredible bond between me and Shimra. And I was quite glad that people could only hear the audio because the two of us had tears streaming down our face, basically kind of sharing that story about this bond between us and our brothers. So that made me kind of realize I don't necessarily want to know people's backstory. I want them to tell it to me, and I want to get hyper curious about that. So when they're telling me, I left that job and I did something else, I'm like, oh, hang on. So what motivated you to do that? So I'm trying to get as curious as possible in those moments.
Are you tempted to stray away from the needs of your topic area when you do that? Like your audience's needs?
Yeah, sometimes. Well, I mean, the way I kind of see it is if we're going down a branch, like if they're telling me some of their backstory and I find it insanely interesting, the reason I'm finding that interesting is because it is something that is probably relevant, for me, which means also for entrepreneurs. So for me, if we don't go fully down the path of the topic, for example, then we just modify as we're going. It's not a live show, so I can always change the title of the show afterwards. That's not a problem. If we were going to talk about LinkedIn leads and suddenly we're talking about mental health for entrepreneurs, to me, that's probably more important to the audience than, generating some leads on LinkedIn. So I'm quite happy to kind of go with the flow on those and see where they end up. Sometimes that's backfired. I've had a couple of shows where it was a bit of hard work. Like I had to try and draw things out of people, and I'm like, oh, and it's not quite going in the direction I thought. But I've had others that have just flowed so beautifully and gone in directions and tangents that I never thought they would. It's been so much fun.
Yeah, and while you're talking there, I'm curious about even the show that I'm doing here right now for content creators and them learning. And I'm wondering, I'm enjoying the conversation. It's going wonderfully well, and I'm learning from you. But is it sufficient to say, well, I'm keeping it on track for the needs and expectations of the content creator who's listening to this?
I think the answer to that is only you know your audience. Like you have your audience follow you. They follow you. They follow your interviews with guests. So you'll work out what works for them and what doesn't. and stick to that. Always stand by your principles, man. That's why I turned down, I almost said their name, actually. That would be terrible. I turned down a very high-profile entrepreneur to be on the show because my values do not align with theirs. And, I had them on a pre-call, and I realized, what am I doing here? Like, I only entertained the thought of them coming on my show because I thought it was good for my brand. I thought this is a very well-known entrepreneur. If I'm associated with that person, that could elevate my brand. And then realized, wait a minute, I don't want to be associated with that person. I've read their book. It's terrible. It's bad advice. Nobody should listen to this rubbish because it's all about hustle and grind, and it's all about basically taking advantage of people, and it's all the unethical stuff that I hate in our industry. So I'm like, well, that doesn't align with me. So I had to stick to my guns. And I can tell you by doing that, yes, it upset that person. I was very respectful with it. I just said to them, look, I can't waste your time, and I don't want to waste your time. I know how busy you are, but I don't think my audience is a good fit for you. Which, to be fair, they were okay with that comment. It was when I turned around and said, and I don't think you're a good fit for my audience, that they didn't handle that part very well. And I learned a lot of new swear words that day because they yelled them all at me.
So sorry,
yeah,
I apologize.
Go for it. I was just going to say the fact that I stuck to my guns on there, I think showed integrity. And I think that's what really resonates, even though they would never hear that. The fact that I do have that integrity on the show is what resonates with my audience. And I have, the fan base I've got for, well, I won't even call it fan base because it's not a fan of me, but a fan of what we're teaching and what we're helping with is a rabid fan base. Like, honestly, I get so many messages and emails and DMs from people who have been affected in some way on the show, or have, like one woman in particular in Canada heard me interviewing someone on the show, and that woman's story spoke to her because she thought she was the only one in the world that had ever gone through this. She's like, oh my God, I can't believe somebody else has been through the same thing as me. But in hearing that story, it motivated her to address that, and motivated her to actually seek help, which has helped her business incredibly. So I have a lot of people reach out with stuff like that. So just sticking true to your values and sticking true to what what's important to you, I think will produce an amazing episode.
It's wonderful that your show Chasing the Insights, it even serves content creators like myself, because I learned about pre-calls from your show and I adopted it. And I love what you outlined in terms of you do it for 3 reasons: setting the expectations, learning about the person, and building rapport. And where I have done it, it works wonderfully well with the guest, and even cuts down the time that I spend as a content creator investigating the person, because I am suspecting that 24 hours to prepare for an interview that is about 30 minutes long is a bit too long. Do you have when you're assessing going on to a show as well, like, would you have done some sort of consideration and background check to say, well, okay, Caribbean content creators, I think I could fit there? What that process looks like for you?
Yeah, and look, theoretically, yes, I do. It doesn't always play out that way, and that's because I get a lot of requests for people to have me on their show. And I must admit, there's been times like this one time last week where I had about 4 shows in the same day that wanted me to be on theirs, and I got them completely mixed up. So I actually didn't know what topics I was talking about on any one of them. So we always have a quick chat. And I mean, you and I did before we even push record here is, hey, what's the flow going to be? And I always ask them that. Now, I'm also the type of person that I love public speaking. I'm one of these rare people, Lyndon, that I will, you put me on stage and I'm in my happy place. I'm genuinely in my happy place. In fact, I can tell you the best conference I've ever done, right? It wasn't the biggest ever or anything like that. It was only about, I think, 5,000 people. But the reason it was so good is because they approached me and said, we want you to do an opening keynote for us, or one of the first keynotes. And I said no. And the reason I said no is because I was going to be on holiday. Now, this was in Sydney, and it just so happens me and my wife were actually on holiday in Sydney. So they said, well, would you consider doing a breakout session for us? So I talked to my wife, and she said, yeah, no, go do it. She goes, do the breakout session, because then I can go and do the shopping that you don't want to be around for, like shoes, for example. And I'm like, yeah, great idea. So we got over to Sydney, and I'm all queued up to do this breakout session. So we turns out we're in the same hotel as the conference, and the conference was about to start. So we were checking into the hotel, and my wife said, hey, we'll go down, grab the swag bags, because you get, often at these conferences, you get a bag of goodies as a speaker. Go down, grab that, see what it is, put it back in the hotel room, then we'll go shopping. I said, yeah, sure. Walked in the door. One of the conference organizers saw me and freaked out, and he was like, Vince, help. And I went, what? And he goes, our opening keynote is stuck at an airport in San Francisco. He goes, we haven't been able to find someone to replace him. Can you do it? And I'm like looking, and it's like half an hour from that time, right? So I've only got half an hour. I looked at my wife and went, well, and she goes, do it. Like, she was cracking up laughing. She goes, I knew you were going to love doing this. And I said, okay, I'll do it. What do you want me to speak on? And he goes, oh, I have no idea. I said, that's a good, I've got it. So I got up on stage half an hour later, stood in front of everyone. I had no slides, no anything. I didn't even really know where it was going to go. I just stood in front of them all and said, hey, look, told them the story, how the keynote stuck overseas. So now you're stuck with me. So I said, I've got no idea where this is going. And we just went down all these rabbit holes, and everyone was laughing. And we had a brilliant time. That's the kind of ad-libbing that I love doing. Now, not everyone can do that. So if you're not confident with speaking off the cuff, and you're not confident with public speaking at all, and you want to be on someone's show, definitely do your research. Listen to at least 3 episodes before you go on there, especially if you're a nervous speaker, because you'll hear the flow and you'll hear how things kind of outgo on the episode. But also clarify with the host. Reach out to them and say, hey, we've got a episode coming up, a recording coming up in 3 days' time. I just want to double check with you. Is there anything you need from me? Just clarifying the topic. Is there any specific things you want me to cover, etc. And send that out to the host. Because as a host, I can tell you now, that means a lot when people do that, because it means they're taking it seriously. But it also will give you the confidence to be prepared for the episode.
That's something I definitely need to work on, because interestingly, I am into vlogging. I would do the podcasting here, but when it comes to the public speaking, and I think it's a certain dimension that you need as a content creator to become more confident along those lines. And that's one of the things that I would like to work on. That if someone requests a keynote speaker, I could be ready for the event in 30 minutes time.
The funniest thing though, Lyndon, was I knew one of the other speakers there, and apparently he had been asked as well, because the organizer didn't know that I was coming that early. So he had asked this person. The person just turned around and went, hell no. Like, I'm not prepared for that.
Exactly.
They wanted to run out of the room. Yeah.
And I mean,
Whereas I jumped at it.
The opportunities that it presents when you do things like this, whether it's, meeting someone or just an exchange of ideas. So it's something definitely to work on. As a podcaster, what are some of your favorite tools and software that you could share with us?
Audacity is my number one favorite. That's what I use for all my editing. So Audacity is absolutely brilliant. It's free, it's open source, and it's a really powerful but really low resource hungry audio editor. So it doesn't chew up your CPU and your RAM and all that kind of stuff. Obviously Calendly for booking. Having a booking system is imperative, especially when you're dealing with people around the world. Otherwise you end up in what we all do in the early days of going, so what time zone are you in? What time zone am I in? Oh, hang on. And you're trying to translate that using some translation tool or whatever. It's no doubt you're always going to end up stuffing it up. So actually having something that does all that for you, like Calendly, there's also TidyCal, there's a bunch of different programs out there that can do it for you. And then the other one is I just use Zoom for everything, man. Like, all my recordings are done on Zoom, and I love it because there's a setting in Zoom where you can split out the audio files. So when you're recording it, it'll record the video, and it'll record an audio file for you and an audio file for me. So when you're putting those on Audacity, and this has happened to me before, if I've had a guest on the show where, I'm there going, hello, really loud, and they're like really quietly, then I can up the audio on theirs. I can amplify it and make it a little bit louder so it equalizes out between the two of us. So those are some of my best ones. I mean, Canva for all of our graphics and things like that. MailerLite for my subscriber base and my emails and things. I keep it very, very simple. That's about the maximum of what I use.
Yeah, and Calendly was a brilliant recommendation. So once again, thank you very much for that.
No problem. There is one other tool actually, Lyndon, Trello. Huge fan of Trello because it helps me and my team manage where we're at. But the beauty of it as well is I put all the episodes in Trello, so that when someone is jumping on a call with me and they say, oh, when will this episode go out? I can literally go down and go, you're due to go out in December. And they're like, so that's, yeah.
So we're getting around to talking about your book shortly. In a podcast, I heard you caution podcasters against using Anchor.fm. Is that a sentiment you still share?
Yes, it is actually. I get a lot of stick for this one as well. People going, grumpy at me. I'm not affiliated with any podcasting hosting platform. Now, I use Libsyn personally, but whenever I tell people that's not my recommendation, that's just something that works for me, right? So, and the reason I chose Libsyn was because I went through, and if you're ever launching a podcast, you'll know this because you research all the hosts out there and you're like, oh my goodness, there's so many of them and I can't tell the difference between them, and it's hard to compare. So what I did was I worked out what was important to me. I knew how many episodes I was going to do per week and all those kind of things. And then what I did was I reverse engineered all the podcasts that I like listening to. So if there was, Pat Flynn, for example, he's got a huge podcast. So you can tell from the RSS feed, the link for it, what platform they use. So it was like no brainer. But the other thing is, I also noticed if you go onto Facebook, for example, in a podcasting group, and you say to people, hey, what podcasting host should I use? You'll get 3 or 4 people in there probably going, hey, you should use Libsyn. You'll get 3 or 4 people going, hey, you should use Buzzsprout, which is another great one, by the way. Maybe a couple of people saying you should use Riverside. And then you'll have about 300 or 400 people saying you should use Anchor. And they all share their links there because Anchor is very affiliate driven. And that's how Anchor is so popular and how they've grown, is because people are incentivized to share their links out there because they get extra airtime or they get extra benefits or extra money from the advertising, all sorts of stuff. But the problems I have with Anchor are quite serious. So one of them is around their terms and conditions. And this is something it's a bit gray. Like they've changed it and modified it over the years, but it's still it's not optimal. And basically what it is it kind of says to you that you don't own your own IP. And this is really important to me because I have a publishing company, and a lot of traditional publishers, a lot of entrepreneurs don't know, if you publish with Simon Schuster or Wiley or any of them, you don't own your own IP. You can't just take your book and give it away. They go, no, you have to buy the book. And it's like, but it's my book. No, it's not. It's ours. Same principle with Anchor. Technically, Anchor own your IP. Now, they will never call you on that. That should never be a problem. But there is the potential there that if, suddenly, Lyndon, everyone just realizes how amazing a podcaster you are. And then, Netflix comes to you and says, hey, Lyndon, not only are you a great podcaster, you're incredibly good looking. We want to create a TV show where you interview all these guests and we're going to pay you, $20 million to do that. There's a chance at least that Anchor could turn around and say, well, actually, technically we own the IP. So therefore you now give us a big chunk of that money as well. Now, the chance of that happening, very small, but it is there. And to me, the fact that they haven't corrected that properly is a problem. But the other 2 reasons I have an issue with them is you cannot control or necessarily control the advertising that's on there, which is a problem. So for me, like I said, I don't have advertising at all. I don't want to be on a platform that forces advertising. But then the other challenge I've got is around the fact that whenever you're using something like this, so for example, whether using Libsyn or Buzzsprout or any of those ones, you also set up an account with Apple Podcasts. So you have to be verified by Apple Podcasts. So therefore, when you put a new episode on Libsyn, it distributes to Apple Podcasts and every other platform and things. On Anchor, you don't have to set up that Apple Podcast connection. And a lot of people think that's great because Anchor do it for them because they've got this relationship with Apple. So anytime you set up on Anchor, automatically approves you for being on Apple Podcasts. The problem with that is that means you don't own the connection with Apple. And that's very important because 50% of your traffic is going to come through Apple Podcasts. That's 50% of the people listen to podcasts on Apple. Now, that sounds like it's not an issue. However, if there was ever any fallout between Anchor and Apple and they severed that connection, you are now left high and dry. You now have a podcast, you're going to have to migrate to another platform, but you don't own that link to Apple Podcasts at all. So you will lose that connection. You have to start again on that. And that doesn't sound like something that's possible. Like people go, oh, well, they'll never have a fallout with Apple. But actually, it could happen. And it's almost happened a number of times because Anchor are renowned for piracy. So the amount of times that, because you can set up a free account on Anchor. So the amount of times people have just downloaded all the audio from Joe Rogan's show, they've set it up, taken the graphics and everything, put it onto Anchor and created their own Joe Rogan podcast and quickly gone out there and told people about it. And all of a sudden, there's thousands of people going and listening to that podcast because they think it's Joe Rogan's official one. They're getting all the advertising money for that. And then Anchor realize and go, whoops, and take it down. There's no penalty for that person for that. Now, that is a problem, and that's something that is really peeing off Apple Podcasts and many other podcasters as well. And the fact that Anchor aren't proactively doing anything about it could cause tension to the point where Apple turn around and say, you know what, we've had enough. We're done. You're out of here. So those are the kind of things that I just don't like. I don't like anything that's heavily affiliate culture as well, because it means any information you're getting about that is biased already. So yeah, but like I said to everyone, do your own research. If Anchor does work for you, then great. That's awesome. I just caution people based on those principles.
I'll tell you why I use Anchor.fm. I'm new to
Yep.
I am new to the game. I'm not
Sure.
monetized. In fact,
Yep.
a lot of the social platforms can't be monetized in the Caribbean.
Oh, wow.
Is that sufficient justification for me to say I'm not making any money out of this? I'm trying something. So let me use a service like Anchor. Or should I seriously consider saying, you know what, it's going to cost me $20 a month for 10 hours of upload time, and that is worth it, even though I'm not generating money off of the podcast in any way?
Well, I mean, only you can answer that question. I always preface it with that. But look, I mean, that's a really good scenario. I mean, one of the things I always say to people is when you're starting your podcast, you've got to have a clear vision of where you're heading, right? And it may not be a crystal clear vision of where you're heading, but it's got to be at least a vague, vision of where you're going. And if where you're going is monetization, then I would take it seriously, and I would look at something like Libsyn or Buzzsprout or Riverside or something like that. However, if what you're doing is having some fun, or what you're doing is not monetizing, and you're just going to grow it to a point, then there's no reason why you can't use something like Anchor. And then when you take it more seriously, say you start basing it in the US or something along those lines, and you're like, okay, well, now I can monetize this show. Now I can take this more. So you can migrate from Anchor across to another platform.
Now, Vince, I know the Zoom time has some limited time here left, but I definitely want to close off talking about your book and any promotions with it. Should we resume the Zoom call? I'm sorry, I don't have a pro account that it goes unlimited.
Oh, okay. We'll talk about 3 minutes. Let's do it.
Congratulations on your book, ChatGPT for Marketers. It's published on February 1st, 2023, and is a practical guide for using AI. So what are some practical tips that you can give podcasters when it comes to using ChatGPT to plan podcast interviews?
You could use ChatGPT for anything. This is the thing I love about it, man. But as a podcaster, though, some of the things you can do is you can use it to ask questions. So you can actually ask ChatGPT and say, hey, look, I've got this person coming up on my show. They're an expert in this. You can even copy and paste their bio in there and say, what are some really interesting questions that I can ask them? And get it to give you some prompts, because it's the main reason I use ChatGPT is for ideation. It's coming up with fresh ideas. And this is a great way to do that. The other thing you can do is once you've finished your show, grab a transcription of that, throw it into ChatGPT and go, what's some really good social posts I can create around this? Include emojis, make it exciting, make it engaging, and have a clear call to action that they listen to the show. And then it'll churn out. And if you tell it to give you 10 social media posts, it will do that. The other thing you can do is get it to come up with a name for your episode title. So actually going in there and saying, hey, we just had a good conversation about XYZ, and there was some really, maybe copy and paste some of the transcription in there. And then you say, can you come up with an engaging and I hate the term, but it works, clickbaity kind of title or a title that's catchy that people want to click on that we can use for this episode. So that's just some of the kind of simple ones. The other things, I mean, you can do anything. You can literally put the transcription of an episode in there and say, hey, ChatGPT, can you create a checklist that I can use as a lead magnet based on this episode? Or can you create some social media posts that are hot tips based on what we actually talked about in this show?
Vince, I thoroughly enjoyed this episode. I've learned so much from you in a short space of time. ChatGPT for Female Entrepreneurs is your next book, and I will include links in the show notes. And thank you very much for your time, Stan. I look forward to being in touch with you when you visit the Caribbean one day.
Oh, definitely. And thank you so much for having me on the show. Love your accent. I'd be on your show anytime just to hear that accent and just to hang out with you, of course.
Thank you very much, sir.
Wonderful.
All right.
Thanks.
Have a pleasant day.